I want to welcome everyone for this event that marks the release of the final report of the CNAS Task Force on the Future of U.S. Coercive Economic Statecraft. As everyone who's participating in this event probably knows well, the last couple of administrations have seen a really explosive growth in the use of coercive economic tools by the United States to meet a really broadening array of national security challenges, policy goals. We've seen subsequent presidencies increase the use of sanctions. Over the past 4 years, the Trump administration has expanded other parts beyond sanctions of the coercive economic toolkit to include export controls and investment restrictions. And in the waning days of the current administration, we see new sanctions coming on Iran, on Turkey, on China, and others. And this upward pattern of use of coercive economic tools has raised a number of questions in the minds of many of the practitioners about what the best mechanisms are through which to exert economic power, whether there's a danger of overusing these tools. Are there meaningful distinctions to be made between sanctions put in place for foreign policy reasons and those put in place for trade reasons or narrower economic reasons? How conditional should these kinds of sanctions be? When, if ever, should they be relaxed? And perhaps above all, how long will America's comparative advantage in their use last? And how can we preserve that comparative advantage as to the best degree possible? So the upshot of this is that it seems pretty clear that the use of coercive economic tools will remain the instrument of choice for those wishing to use sticks rather than carrots, either to shape foreign behavior or even just to express opposition to it. In July of 2019, CNAS launched the Task Force on the Future of U.S. Coercive Economic Statecraft in order to answer some of these questions and examine the expanding use of these measures. Brought together a wide array of practitioners and top thinkers and foreign policy experts and business leaders who deliberated over 18 months to analyze the use of this and come up with some specific ideas for how to take things forward. And the final report of that task force is what we're here to discuss today. So we have with us the principal co-authors, Liz Rosenberg and Peter Harrell, as well as the co-chairs who will be speaking in just a moment. And they and the other speakers will be able to discuss the substance of this report and also other thoughts that they have about the use of coercive economic measures and the future thereof. Let me just remind folks as we get started, this event is on the record and being broadcast live. It's public. And with that, let me thank the speakers who have joined us today, of course, the co-authors and all of the other participants here, and turn it over to Adam Zubin, who co-chaired the task force and who, along with Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, so ably guided the work of the task force over the months. So thank you, and Adam, over to you.
Thanks so much, Richard, and huge thanks to you and to CNAS for housing us in this task force, previous task forces that I've had the honor of being involved in, where I think some of the best thinking is going on, as you said, by practitioners, people in the world of think tanks, academia, former government, and potentially future government officials who have a hand in making and shaping the policy. So it's really been a tremendous pleasure to be with CNAS for all of that. I want to offer first a few thank yous on behalf of Paula and myself. First to Carlos Gutierrez, who began as co-chair with us on this task force and unfortunately had to step away. For him, for a positive thing, he launched a new business venture and simply wasn't able to balance the time with what we're doing here, but also provided a lot of input and his own thinking, which was invaluable. I want to give special thanks to Liz and to Peter, who are not just the principal authors of this report, but the engines for everything that we've done and the substantial thought and coordination that's gone on behind the scenes. Big thank you to all the members of the task force. You'll hear from a few of them shortly, but it has really been a group effort in every sense of the word. And there has been a lot of interesting and I think productive dissent and disagreement among the members of the task force, and that's just what you would want to see. Finally, big thanks to Sam Dorsheimer and Ashley Feng, who played an outsized role in getting the paper across the finish line. In terms of the mission or the purpose of what we were trying to do here, I want to state what sometimes goes unstated, which is all of the members of this task force, I believe, and they can correct me if I'm wrong, are believers in the potential of the tool or the toolkit. That's not a consensus that's shared, let's say, across the board in Washington, in Congress. There are prominent, outspoken critics of this entire tool set who say that economic coercive measures are incapable of shaping international behavior. And to the extent they do impact, they tend to have regressive impacts that harm populations. And so you're getting the worst of both worlds. You're not shaping the behavior of foreign regimes, and you're oppressing innocent populations. Certainly those risks exist, but I think I speak for the whole task force in saying what brings us together is a belief in the promise and potential of this tool set to have positive impacts, to reshape some of the more aggressive and violent and troubling behavior that we see on the international stage. So if they offer promise, then the question is, how should they best be used? What is a doctrine for the use of these tools? And I think another shared sense of purpose for our group comes out of the fact that this is not a well-developed field. Unlike other areas of diplomacy, national security, the thinking around economic coercive measures is very much in its nascency. And as you'll see in reading our report, the idea that we ought to have a unified way of thinking across the set of tools is also very recent, whether we're talking about export controls, investment controls, financial sanctions, tariffs. How do we use these tools strategically, holistically? That's an area that I think would benefit from a lot of further thought, and that is what brings us together. So a word on the costs, because the use of these tools does bring with it costs, and that was one of our key takeaways. Most obviously, there are economic costs. There are economic costs for U.S. firms when we say you can't export to country X or import from firm X. There are costs to our allies. Second, there are diplomatic costs. And our report notes that when we use these tools in their most aggressive form, sometimes called secondary or extraterritorial sanctions, saying, for example, to South Korea, if you import over X amount of Iranian oil, we're going to cut off your largest banks from the US financial system. Well, that is a very aggressive use of the toolkit, and it comes with decided diplomatic costs. Third, there are longer term costs in how the US is viewed through, not diplomatically, but through an economic lens. In other words, for decades, the US has been viewed as one of the safest places to put your money in terms of foreign reserves, to list your companies in terms of our securities markets, and as a trade partner. And that perception comes from a sense that we are fair, that we adhere to rule of law, that there are courts if there are abuses where you can get redress, and that we are going to be a stable environment for trade, for investment. There are costs in this realm. There's cost to the perception of the US to the extent we're viewed as being highly unilateral, highly aggressive, highly unpredictable. And that's a place where I don't think any of us want to go. And so one of our key takeaways in the report is we need to be measuring those costs. We need to be factoring them into our thinking. As Richard notes, the use of this toolkit is here to stay. regardless of what party occupies the White House, regardless of what party is in the leadership in Congress, we are going to continue to see the use of these tools. And we do need here to be mindful of the role of Congress, because Congress has been increasingly active and brings with it a different approach just by nature of the shape of legislative authority versus executive authority. Congress uses these tools in a different way. We have to be mindful of the costs and benefits of that. And then finally, other nations are beginning to catch up. We are seeing this most heavily with China, which just in the last 18 months has deployed executive authorities, a Hong Kong national security law that very much look like the way the U.S. has used these authorities in a list-based way to deter, to threaten, and they're borrowing a page very much from our playbook. Two more takeaways. There's a need when using these tools to have clearly stated objectives. And to say that almost sounds like you're stating the obvious, but the US doesn't always do this. Or sometimes we state an objective when we're announcing a suite of sanctions, and then our objectives change. The goalposts move. So what are we after when it comes to sanctions on Huawei, for example? Is it about sanctions violations and export controls? Is it about trade practices? Is it about national security and the security of our networks? We need to be clear if we want to change behavior. That ought to be fundamental or axiomatic. Final observation, our task force notes that we have underinvested in the positive tools of statecraft and heavily relied on negative. Positive tools of statecraft can be soft power, leading by example. It has to involve domestic economic renewal, sorely needed at this moment. But on the international stage, it's also international finance and trade incentives, development assistance, technical assistance and capacity building. We have tremendous leverage and we use these tools heavily, but not always in a strategic way. I'll close and turn it over to Paula. I do want to share one personal observation, which is, as I was reading the report for the umpteenth time yesterday, I note that a lot of what we're trying to do here is to enforce norms. When we're using this toolkit, we're trying to enforce norms of human rights, cyber norms, nuclear nonproliferation, support for terrorism, intellectual property theft. And you can't enforce norms by simply swinging a bat. We do need to shore up these norms and the institutions on the international scene who stand for and enshrine these norms. Then there's a way to start leaning on the countries who are violators to bring them back into that international, back to the international table. But I think the international table needs some work and some investment of its own. Thanks so much for joining us, and I'll turn it now to Paula.
Adam, thank you so much. You gave an outstanding overview of our deliberations and no less the findings of the report itself. And you also gave a wonderful comprehensive tribute, but I do at least just want to say, if I may, in capacity of being also a co-chair, I do want to thank Richard Fontaine and CNAS and the entire CNAS team. Peter Harrell, Liz Rosenberg as co-authors were brilliant, and our task force members are absolutely stellar. The diversity of the group, how comprehensive, and the way in which the deliberations were taken is just absolutely perfect, in my view, and which I think has led us to this outcome. But finally, I do want to thank you, Adam, and that is, you've been a fantastic co-chair. And really just thank you for all the contributions you've made. So I want to get right to three very distinguished members of the task force who are going to share their reflections this morning. And let's, without further ado, because Adam really gave a comprehensive, substantive overview of the task force, and the outcome of the report. So I'm not going to go there, but I want to go right to Juan Zarate, who will be the first to address and give his view on the report. Juan Zarate, everybody knows you, but let me at least share. You are Global Co-Managing Partner and Chief Strategy Officer, K2 Integrity. Juan, over to you. And if you'll only take about 3 to 5 minutes in your opening comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. I can be very quick, and I want to thank you and Adam for co-chairing the task force so ably, Liz and Peter for always being the key drivers of these projects, and obviously CNAS and Richard for hosting this. I'm a major fan of this project for lots of reasons, and many of you know my body of work and my passion for the space. But I think this task force and this report was necessary. And Paul, I'll be very brief and provide maybe just 3 thoughts that stem from the report, but also maybe challenge it a bit. I think the first thing that this report does incredibly well and importantly is to move beyond the sense that economic statecraft is simply defined by one tool or another, or simply defined by what we call traditionally sanctions. There's no question that the tools in the economic and commercial toolkit from the US government are vast. They've grown more complicated. There are more stakeholders, to include Congress and the private sector, that are helping to define them. But as we think of these tools, they have grown in their both complexity and in their sharpness. That is to say, sanctions are much more complicated today than they were 10, 15 years ago in their both application and scope. When we think of CFIUS and FIRMA, those requirements and that domain and regime is much more complicated. We think about export controls, tariffs, trade, you go down the line. These are just more complicated tools that are intertwined with the economic and commercial system, and with the idea that the US has tried to use these tools more and more for coercive purposes. So that's one important point here, that the tools themselves have grown more complicated, and the report reflects on that and obviously talks about the externalities, but clearly begins to reshape our view and to pull back the lens beyond one tool or another to look at them more broadly, which I think is critical. Which is my second point, Paula. It's clear, especially over the last 4 years, that we're now in a period where we are thinking much more broadly and fundamentally about national economic security. And by that, we mean the full spectrum of tools and the ability to use economic and commercial statecraft to meet national ends and interests. That's always been a part of how we thought about these tools, but not as a cohesive set of tools or strategy. And part of that has to do with the way the Trump administration has used these tools aggressively. Part of it has been defined by the challenge of China, which presents a much more holistic challenge to American power in the economic, technical, military, and diplomatic domains. And part of this is also a reflection of the fact that the private sector has a key role to play in how we think about national economic security. And that's something I think that the report also reflects on. And to Adam's point, and I think it's a critical one, the perception of how the US uses its tools, its power, its centrality in the international financial system becomes a key feature in how we think about the implementation of national economic security strategies writ large. So I think that's something that the Biden administration is going to have to deal with. And then a quick final point, Paula, but perhaps the most important one. I think those of us who've watched this space and been a part of it for a while recognize that this domain and discipline, though it's immature, to Adam's point, without a doubt, is now much more central to how we think about foreign policy. And I think this is important, and this is maybe where I want to stretch the report a bit more. It's not just that these are tools of economic statecraft in aid of other strategies or other domains like diplomacy. This is now a domain unto itself with its own rules, its own discipline, its own dynamics, which at times can conflict with diplomacy. And we've seen that, of course, in the context of unwindings and other diplomatic domains. It's often the centerpiece of conflict, as we've seen with China in Hong Kong. And it's also, frankly, how the targets of these of these measures now see themselves engaged in a much different kind of competition, if not conflict, with the U.S., which is to say, many of the targets, like the Russians, see this as part of a broader hybrid warfare campaign. So my final point here is, this isn't just about economic statecraft in aid of diplomacy or as an externality to national security policy. This is a domain and discipline unto itself that requires the kind of study and careful considerations that this report reflects, and that I think those of us who are in the space seek to shape and to discipline. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you, Juan. Excellent beginning. And before I go to our next distinguished task force member and panelist, let me invite all of our listeners, please, if you do have questions that you want to put forward, we're going to have hopefully some space to get some questions in here. And so I invite you to please submit them in the Q&A function. Now I'd like to go to our other distinguished task force member, Ted Kassinger, who is a partner with O'Melveny Myers. Get that word out there. Ted, welcome to you, and the floor is yours. Oh, we're not hearing you. You got to put your...
All right, can you hear me?
We can. Great, okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula, Adam, Peter, Liz, and others who have put this wonderful task force and program together. Adam and Juan really did a great job of summarizing key aspects and takeaways from the report. What I'd like to do is just delve down into a couple of points they made as a basis for discussion. I think that, as Adam put it, it becomes ever more important to clearly state the objectives of what one is trying to do in deploying one of these tools as the landscape for using them becomes more complicated and challenging. 1979, we had the Iran hostage crisis, put on sanctions, emergency that still exists underlying those, but it was very, very specific threat, target, and goal: get the hostages released. It's different when you proceed through more amorphous targets, whether it's terrorists or criminals, to countries that aren't Iran or Libya or Sudan. They are strategic competitors and capable at that. So Russia, China, there's a reason there hasn't been full-blown economic sanctions targeting both those countries. They have nuclear weapons and the capability to fight back in so many ways, and that's what we're seeing. I don't think in many ways our use of tools has quite caught up to our recognition of the different kind of environment that we're trying to use the traditional tools in. But there's also an important point, again, picking up something that on what Juan said, and Adam as well. Adam noted correctly that generally what we're trying to do is enforce international norms of behavior and conduct. And Juan correctly noted that in general, this, or traditionally, has been the use of these tools in aid of diplomacy to achieve that enforcement of norms. I think what it's important to recognize that without saying so, and maybe without recognizing, this set of tools is morphing into something even more. So one has to ask whose behavior you're trying to change and how. And what's the link between sanctions and changing that behavior? So for example, if your goal is not merely to push China back into compliance with accepted norms in the WTO, but rather to decouple our economies with an underlying theme of economic security or traditional national security, that's a lot different in terms of the tools you use and how you measure success. If you're trying to alter supply chains or cultivate domestic protect your supply chain. It really doesn't matter if China decides to adhere to WTO rules in that case, because the behavior the measures are trying to alter is of our own citizens and our own companies. We're trying to bring companies back to the US in that case, or to a narrower set of allies that we feel more secure in dealing with. And so these measures, so we're starting to see much broader array of tools that are not traditional sanctions. So tariffs, Section 301, CFIUS, many other items or things are being looked at that one just never thought of before. It's somewhat interesting that the legal basis for many of the tools that are deployed, at least under IEEPA, is the declaration of a national emergency. And we know that emergencies are proliferating and they never go away. They stay forever. They're no longer emergencies, but they're being used to justify tools that then change, but based on the same authority. And it's striking the non-IEEPA use of authorities to achieve some of these goals as well, more recently. I mean, just last week, or was it earlier this week, the president signed an executive order directing the Secretary of HHS and others to come up with a plan for ensuring that the United States Corona-19 vaccines only go to US persons until everyone has gotten one. Now, it doesn't say, the order doesn't say how that's going to be enforced, and so maybe IEEPA will be invoked or not, or maybe that was just an order to support a press conference. But we've seen, if you look at the critical minerals executive order in September, it's the same idea. We've got a limited supply of certain things. We need to change the behavior or prevent US persons from exporting those because we need to keep them ourselves. So this is an area that I think deserves attention. Again, it goes to whose behavior are we trying to change. The last thing I do want to say is about how you measure effectiveness, the cost and benefits. This is very, very difficult. There are a lot of specific costs you can point to, but I think it's the longer term corrosion of the US position in the global economy in terms of individual companies, the trustworthiness of commercial relationships, not just of the country on a country to country basis, but are US suppliers trustworthy? US companies need global scale to support the scale of investment in research and development to accomplish the great things that our companies have. If you take away the world's largest market, in the case of China, then the resources are substantially reduced. That's just going to be a fact. So that is a cost, hard to measure, but over the long term, we've made both deprive US companies of resources they need, while also heavily incentivizing our adversaries to take their place. So let me stop there, Paula.
Right, Ted, thank you so much. You provided a different perspective. Before I go to our third very distinguished panelist and task force member, let me just announce, because to make clear, the report that we're talking about, the title of it is America's Use of Coercive Economic Statecraft. It is on CNAS's online. I know there was a question that came in on that, so I wanted to clarify that up front. Please go right ahead. You should be able to access it. Now it gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce Catherine Novelli. Catherine is president of Listening for America. And Catherine, we're looking very much forward to your comments. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paula. Thanks to Adam. Thanks to Peter and Liz for all their great work. It was an honor to be part of this group and to think about these issues, which during my time as undersecretary were things that we really had to confront on a direct basis when Russia invaded Ukraine. And just taking some lessons from that and building on what Ted and Juan have said, I think some of the key lessons are that we are much more effective at using these tools, as Adam said, when they're part of a strategy, a larger strategy for us domestically, and when we think it through. And that strategy does need to include sort of the carrots, if you will, the positive aspects of what a relationship can be, not just with the US, but more globally. And so issues of things like trade agreements and aid and engagement and other kinds of diplomatic agreements are also tools that need to be thought about in the context of using these tools. And they need to be thought about not just vis-a-vis directly whatever country's behavior, whatever that country is that you're trying to affect, but who's around that country, what countries are around that country, and what can you do to start creating maybe a different paradigm of behavior among neighbors. So I think that is hugely important. The other thing that at least I've found and that is hugely important is thinking about this not just only unilaterally. And going to what Ted said about costs, one of the difficulties, particularly when you do sanctions, and you say to your own companies, you can't trade this, that, or the other thing with another country. If that is, you're not the only ones who are supplying that, the only ones who are making it, and you are not working with the other countries who are suppliers. So a good example is when we're looking at putting sanctions on high level things related to the development of oil and gas vis-a-vis Russia. Well, Europe was the other big supplier. If we didn't have them on board, then we were basically adversely affecting our own industry and having zero impact on Russia because European companies would just fill the gap. And so I think it is very important that we think strategically when we are going to impose these things about who else are suppliers and thinking about how we get all of those folks on board with what we are trying to do. Certainly looking bilaterally engaging those countries is very important and was certainly critical with respect to those sanctions that we worked together with Europe on, but also working through the UN, which has been, I think, a lot of folks think is not as strong as it should be on some of these things. I think getting some recognition that some universal norms are being violated is an important underlying bolster to the behavior that's being done. Last point that I would make is we also have to think, especially in the context of CFIUS and some of the investment issues, that again, we're operating in a multilateral world. And so when we are thinking about prohibiting investment in a US company, we have to think about, all right, that's for access to that company's technology. Is that company solely located in the US? And we confronted this with Syngenta, which was in the US and in Switzerland, and where we had a situation where Swiss said, we don't mind if China takes over Syngenta. Then we say, well, you can't do it here in the US. That technology is in the hands of China in any event. So I think we really have to think about in this globalized world that we are not going to be as effective if we only look internally at ourselves as an island, but we have to take into account the reality that we are intertwined with other countries, and how do we get people working together and marching in step? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Each of you have really addressed the issue from different angles. I want to dive in with a question that I know is on the mind of Adam Zubin. And then I'd like to give Peter Harrell and Liz Rosenberg a chance to pose a question. And we do have a number of very good questions from our listeners that I also want to take into account the time we have. The question that I do want to put on the table is, what should U.S. policymakers make of China's increasing use of U.S.-style coercive measures, such as broad list-based authorities that can carry extraterritorial impacts, like the secondary sanctions? And as we know, under the Hong Kong national security law, and exports controls under the new export control law. And how can those measures be used to influence or threaten the behavior of third country firms? This is an important question. And Juan, may I go to you first? And if Ted and Kathy want to jump in, please. Juan.
Thank you, Paula. It's a great question. Frankly, it's one that was anticipated. And I think that China had begun to forecast a bit with the use of its economic resources over the last decade in diplomatic disputes. Remember the rare earth mineral cutoff, export cutoff with Japan, for example, in the midst of a dispute. The threat to sanction U.S. defense companies for sales of defense equipment to Taiwan, the cutoff of imports from the Philippines as part of maritime disputes. So this has been, in some ways, the Chinese beginning to flirt more aggressively with their economic and commercial power for diplomatic purposes, the same way that we have thought about the use of these tools. What's happening now, though, I think is something different, because the Chinese have a more expansive global footprint with their state-owned enterprises and their presence. They have broader interests, and they've learned, certainly from the United States, as to how to use these tools in a way that is more aggressive and that challenges the private sector, not just in their neighborhood, but globally, to adhere to the policies that China may want. And so I think this is just the beginning of a greater challenge from China in the use of these kinds of tools, broadly speaking, in part because they're already predisposed to thinking in this way to use these tools, but also they've got a broader footprint while they're also challenging standards and norms for behavior. And I think this is precisely why they've challenged in Hong Kong, because they're not only defending their law, but they're challenging how U.S. sanctions, Western sanctions, get applied in their backyard, and they want to force a decision to be made. And so I think we're going to see more of this over time, and I think it's going to be a real challenge to not just U.S. sanctions, but also the norms that underline and that undergird the power of those sanctions.
I think it was an important question that had been put forward by Adam, and your answer, Juan, is certainly very spot on. Kathy, I saw you shaking your head. Do you want to jump in on this? Add any points?
Yeah, I would just add to what Juan said that in addition to taking a page out of our book in terms of looking at how to apply sanctions in this kind of very directed way, China is got this whole situation as part of a much broader strategy. If you think about the Belt and Road Initiative, if you think about all the work they're doing in Africa, they have agreements, they have aid, they're building infrastructure, they set up the Asian Infrastructure Bank. And so this is not just happening in a vacuum. And I think it is really important to see the way in which they are very strategic about what they're doing and building support through these other mechanisms that is a ballast against this kind of behavior.
Ted, do you have a quick point you'd like to make too? You need to unmute. Not yet. You need to unmute.
Yes, sorry. Just quickly, I agree with Juan and Kathy. I would just add this: the effectiveness of China's sanctions that mimic our tools, I think is going to be much more limited to the extent you try to see them in the same way we see our tools. There's not a lot of technology that they're going to be denying somebody that wants it. Travel, financial arrangements, all those things, are not going to be much affected by blocking statutes in China is the way they are here. But I do think that as part of this bigger flexing of muscles, it is the way the future will unfold. But I think in the short term, at least, we're mostly going to see much cruder types of reactions and attempts to enforce the same kinds of goals, but without legal tools. So response to U.S. attacks on Huawei, they kidnap people. I mean, they just threaten their neighbors, or, there's just other cruder things that are not going to be bounded by any kind of rules that we have and as we implement sanctions.
All right, thank you,
Paula,
Ted.
if I could just come in with 30 seconds on Ted's last point, which I think is key. China and the US have in some ways complementary strengths and weaknesses when it comes to the use of our unilateral tools. China has stronger influence when it comes to limiting, let's say, tourism, as they did with South Korea. Imports, as Juan points out, they did with the Philippines over South China Sea. We're better on the financial tools. But on another axis, China has zero, I would say China is tremendously weaker than the US, and that's alliances. When you look at the Xinjiang treatment of the Uyghurs, when you look at Hong Kong, when you look at the South China Sea, China stands alone. And so where we have the ability to greatly outcompete China in the use of this leverage is in our alliances and is in reestablishing those norms that we were talking about earlier.
Thank you, Adam. Actually, I was even thinking of swinging over to you to see if you had a comment, because knowing that question was important to you. Peter and Liz, would you like to interject a question at this time? We do have a good number of questions in from our listeners that I'd like to go to as many as I can. Peter and Liz. Peter, over to you first.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks for all of you who are joining us today. And many thanks, Paula and Adam, for chairing our task force, and for all of you for participating in our task force. My question is picking up, Ted, on some of your comments that you made in your opening remarks. And it does seem to me that kind of the current frontier of coercive economic measures in many respects is these kind of, with China, is these import restriction kind of measures and these decoupling type measures, where we seem to be, as a country, embracing the idea that we are not going to change a number of aspects of China's behavior, and are instead, Ted, as you said, going to change Americans' behavior in order to sort of secure our defenses, if you will. And I think that kind of an approach is interesting and different from the approach that, have generally guided coercive economic measures kind of since the 9/11 era, at least coercive economic measures targeting countries, which have generally been aimed at changing the target country's behavior. And I think it raises a bunch of the issues that Kathy and you both put on the table about, unintended consequences, about the fact China is a serious competitor that has a lot of its own resources. And I'd be interested in hearing you elaborate a little bit more, Ted or Kathy, at how you think policymakers should thread this needle, where there is a very clear desire to reduce Americans' dependence on China, at least in a couple of key, sectors and products, without opening up a kind of a Pandora's box with a ton of unintended consequences to come down the road.
Thank you. Before you both answer, can we get Liz's question in? Liz, let's get yours, and then we'll go to Kathy and Ted. That question was directed to them. Liz.
Thanks very much. I'll be brief here. I just wanted to seek your thoughts on how the United States should work with international allies in use of these particular tools, and what issues or functional considerations that the United States should address, should prioritize rather, in this work with certain allies.
Hey, thank you. Kathy, shall we go to you first? Or Ted, you're unmiked. It looks like let's go to you. You're unmiked.
That rare moment, you've got me.
Yes.
Okay, I'll take a quick shot, starting with Peter's question. So I think this question goes directly to the other really important part of this report, which is emphasizing that we need to pay attention to the positive tools that we have. In many ways, the solutions are not going to be sort of episodic trade measures of any kind. It's going to be investment in the U.S., sort of taking care of our own business rather than trying to put our fingers in the many holes in the dike of the global economy. The government's never going to be as fast and as agile as companies with an economic incentive, and their lifeblood is to figure out how to keep doing business. So technology is going to shift to places where it's not subject to U.S. rules. Companies can deploy R&D around the world. But that doesn't mean the U.S. that these issues are not serious from a national security standpoint and indeed need to be addressed. What's the balance? I think enhanced export controls are important. Historically, we've tried to decontrol technologies after U.S. companies have achieved a certain generational advantage, 2 or 3 generations ahead, rather than just say we're not going to export X, Y, or Z. And that's an attempt to permit companies to continue to do business around the world, not incentivize competitors while maintaining a technological edge. I think we need to continue to apply that, but revive it in the context of the new technologies that we're seeing. And at the same time, we have to find ways to incentivize, through domestic support, contracts, other things, things like building foundry capacity in the U.S. The move offshore of semiconductor foundry capacity since the early mid 90s is a very threatening thing, and most of the world's semiconductor capacity is in Taiwan. That is a real threat, but preventing Taiwanese foundries from making products going to a large market next door is probably not the way to solve our problem. So I think the part of this report that focuses on self-help is really important.
Right. Thank you for that, Kathy.
Yeah, I would totally agree with what Ted said. I think, we're not going to compete by keeping other people down. We're really going to compete by running faster and looking to our P's and Q's and what we need to do. And I would agree with Ted about export controls. I would add on top of that the theme that I've been stressing, which is I think if we just do export controls by ourselves, it's way less effective than if we can get Europe to go with us. And I think that there's a much more likelihood of success there, and also giving us still some larger market in which to play. I think on the other side, the reality is China supplies us with a lot of things, and we aren't going to be able to just cut that off overnight. And it's not clear to me that that is the way in which we will have the biggest ability to help change things. So the question to me is threading the needle of engagement in a way that is going to still give us leverage, but also protect our own economic and national security. And that is going to have to be something that's thought through very, very carefully. And to Liz's point about engaging with allies, I think we absolutely have to do that, and we have to do it in a coherent way. We have to have a theory of the case, not just why it's good for us, but why it's good for them to move with us together. Without that, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to just be the cheese that stands alone.
All right. Thank you so much, Kathy. I want to go to a number of the questions. And if all of you don't mind, I want to actually put a few of them out, take your responses, brief responses, and take another tranche. Let me identify some of the people who put questions out here. Tak-Sung Oh, who's with the Voice of America, asked the question about, will continued sanctions against North Korea still be a useful tool into the year ahead and into the Biden administration? William Janis, who's an adjunct professor at Fordham Law School, he asked the question, do you think the growth of cryptocurrencies will mitigate the efficacy of U.S. economic sanctions and incentivize a movement away from the dollar? And then let me take another at this moment. Adam Stolberg asked the question, given that economic statecraft is a contact sport, success dependent on strategic interaction with target adversary, to what extent does the report's conclusions regarding assessing effectiveness of U.S. economic statecraft take into account the PRC and Russian postures, perceptions of legitimacy, related approaches? What are lessons for tailoring U.S. strategy accordingly? Juan, let's go to you, and I'm hoping for quick responses so we can get a few others in here. Thanks.
Sure, Paul. I'll do lightning round. I think on the first question on North Korea, absolutely. I think North Korea is one of the wicked problems in the international domain, and I think every administration has relied heavily on sanctions. You've seen this last administration try to apply what it's called a maximum pressure campaign. I don't see the Biden administration moving away from the use of sanctions. Liz and Peter may be able to articulate this better than anybody, but I do think there will be different tonalities, different ways of using alliances to apply that pressure in concert with other tools. And I think that's the key with respect to their effectiveness. On crypto, very quickly, Paula, I think that this has been a question raised over and over again. I do think there's a challenge to the dollar writ large long term, potentially, but crypto doesn't currently present that challenge. I think what really is a challenge is the creation of alternate payment platforms that in combination allow for circumvention of the US financial system and even more formal, more regulated financial systems. So the movement, for example, toward decentralized payment models or more disintermediated payment channels becomes a challenge to any enforcement action or ability to regulate. And I think that's what regulators are grappling with. And just a final point, on the context board, there's a lot of dimensions to that question. I'll take one part of it. This question of legitimacy is key, right? And it goes back to Adam's original point about the perception of the use of these tools. If how we're using these tools, whether they're deemed offensive, defensive, positive, negative, if they're not deemed to be legitimate, if they're not seen to be based in international norms and principles, if they're not based in fact, then we begin to lose the competition with China and Russia, who are trying to use similar tools to effectuate their national interests.
I'm going to ask Kathy and Ted, if you don't mind, let me go to the next tranche, if that's okay, because we only have 5 more minutes. All right, thank you. And I did want to share, let me come to it here. Fred Shaheen, Chief Counsel for Global Trade, the Boeing Company. His question was, the report is a truly remarkable work product, which comes as no surprise. What, in the views of the authors, is the logical follow-on for this effort? How does it become further disseminated more broadly outside of the policy community? I'm not going to ask the authors. I'm going to ask the task force members, you guys, to respond to that. And also, by the way, George Lopez also said he loves the report, and can the authors see as a next step specifying any trends regarding coercive statecraft as more effective in some areas, as in proliferation control, versus maybe less in improving human rights. And I'm going to end on this one. Rachel Ziemba, who is a task force member, she comes back to this whole question about China. She says here, you mentioned in the report the concern that China, and others are using U.S. style controls. Is there a risk that the U.S. has been using China style tools at times, including trade management, export restrictions, etc.? How does the U.S. bridge this gap while also trying to coordinate with allies? Kathy, let's go to you first. We have 4 minutes. So each of you get a minute apiece. Do your best.
All right, 1 minute. I think for disseminating the report, I think it's key. I think having a strategy to talk to people outside the Beltway is key. I think that will help build public support for whatever we do on a going forward basis. In terms of China and us using China, I go back to what was said about legitimacy. I think it's really important that we think about, is what we are doing seen as legitimate, and is it legitimate? Because that's the only way that we're going to have credibility to take these kinds of things forward globally.
Right, perfect. Ted.
2 quick things on the legitimacy point. The question was phrased as whether China and Russia view the measures as legitimate. I don't think that matters so much because their concern is they don't like the impact. It's really our allies, those that we're trying to recruit to support, and how they see legitimacy of sanctions targeting China or Russia, that to me is important. The question of legitimacy goes though to the other questions, and particularly with regard to domestic kind of import restricting measures, where the U.S. claims, say, national security for imposing restrictions on imports of steel from Canada. This goes to Juan's point. If you can't have a legitimate fact-based measure that wins legitimacy, then you're making things much worse in terms of achieving the objectives you want to achieve.
Okay, thank you, Ted. Juan, you have 1 minute.
Yeah. Paul, first of all, I just want to say I've learned so much from the task force members, and there's no exception from Kathy and Ted. So I just wanted to say that. Just very quickly on the report and this issue, I think a moment of transition with administrations is a great moment to not only embed these kinds of issues and policies, but to think creatively. And it's not just that you have a change in leadership of the executive. You've got a new Congress coming in. You've got foreign counterparts that are looking to see where policy goes. And you have the private sector looking for greater clarity on where regulations are going to go. Just a note, you're about to have the most significant reform of the Bank Secrecy Act in 20 years passed by Congress and the NDAA. You know, the private sector is impacted by all of this. And I think they're hungry for how to think about these issues moving forward.
Juan, Kathy, and Ted, you're outstanding task force members and outstanding panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about the report today. And Adam Zubin, great to partner with you. And we want to really thank our co-authors, again, Peter, Harrell, and Liz Rosenberg. CNAS has been fantastic. And finally, I do want to thank all of the listeners this morning. Really, thank you for those great questions. It's 11 o'clock. We said we were going to stop then. So just want to thank all of you. Great morning session. Happy holidays to you.
Thank you.